We're going to turn to California a little bit here now. And next speaker is Peg.
Yes. My name is Peg, and I am an alcoholic. I am so happy to be here today. I don't see very well, but I think there are a few people in this room. And I feel that most of us are sober, so that's wonderful. I want to say how pleased I am to be at this convention, especially because it's being held in really my favorite city. I do live in San Francisco, or so close to it, but Seattle is my favorite city. I have been coming here since I was an infant, though I have not lived here for a long time. I went to school here at the university, and I also spent many summers on Bainbridge Island at Wing Point. Boy. So I can't begin to tell you how much it means to me to be on this panel, though I didn't quite realize that I was a pioneer, because I don't think I've been around that long. I didn't really work that hard like the pioneers. I am going to tell you how I got in touch with AA on February the 2nd, 1946. There was no teleservice then, as you will hear. 2 days before that, I was living with a friend and her husband and another woman on Russian Hill in San Francisco, and she took me aside one morning after I had lost my second job because I drank. She said to me, "Peg, you really ought to do something about your drinking." And for the first time, I didn't get angry, I didn't clam up, I wasn't resentful. I knew I couldn't go on any longer. I needed somewhere to turn. And I thought of it in the light of being a sanitarium. There were no recovery homes then. There was nothing like that. So when this friend said, "I'm speaking to you today because I just heard that a group of people, either from the East or the Middle West, they were called Alcoholics Anonymous, and their number is in the phone book in San Francisco." So a lot of you young people don't realize that Alcoholics Anonymous was beginning to flourish in the West. So the next day, I called that number. I got up, and I thought, well, I'll call them at 9 o'clock because I'm sure they'll start business then. I called at 9, I called at 9:30, I called at 10, I called at 10:30, and by that time I wanted a drink. But there was something within me that morning that said, hey, don't take a drink until you talk to that Alcoholics Anonymous. Be clear. So I thought, well, I'd better go down to their office. And it was 143 Bush, and that was in the financial district. So I got down there, and I walked up to the door, and it was locked. I looked in, and there was mail there on the floor, some papers strewn about, and 2 garbage cans covered. And I thought, well, they didn't make it here in San Francisco. And I was really full of despair. I had no place to turn. I had tried to talk to a clergyman once, but he said, "Oh, Peg, you really aren't an alcoholic." Oh, I didn't know I was an alcoholic. I just thought I drank too much. So the reason I wanted to get in touch with Alcoholics Anonymous was so they could tell me how to drink like a lady. Now, that was a term that isn't used so much among all you young people now. Not that you're not ladies, you ladies, but that's what I wanted to do, to drink like a gentleman or drink like a lady. When I was going to college, that was a little phrase we tossed around. So after not getting into that door, I was just about as down and full of despair as I ever have been in my whole life. I didn't know what to do with the rest of my day, and I didn't want to go home because I knew I'd drink. So I thought, well, I'll go to a movie. So I walked over where there were movie houses on Market Street, and I walked into this movie, and I was paying for my ticket, and I noticed what was being shown, The Lost Weekend. And I hadn't even read a review about The Lost Weekend. I went in and I cried during the whole movie, and a nice little old man came over and said, "Lady, are you all right?" And that kind of scared me. I moved to another section of the theater. I walked out of that when it was over, and I went right to the telephone to call that number with Alcoholics Anonymous, no answer. I went to another movie, but I didn't stay very long because I was too upset then. But I did get a flash. Something was helping me. And it said, go to the phone and ask the Better Business Bureau of San Francisco what happened to Alcoholics Anonymous. So I went out into the lobby and I called them, and I'll never forget that call because the woman was very friendly, and she said, "Oh, they don't answer their telephone until 6 o'clock. Are you all right?" I said, "Oh, yes, I'm calling for a friend." So then I went back to my apartment, and I knew I was going to call that place at 6 o'clock, which I did. I talked to a very nice man who was friendly and put me at ease, and he said, "Have you been drinking all day?" And I said, "No, I haven't had a drink since last night." He said, "Well, fine, that's good." He said, "Get down here about 7 o'clock. It was then about 5:45. So my friends drove me down, and I said to the friend that had asked me to do something about my drinking, "Don't say anything to Mabel. I just don't want to talk about it right now." So they drove me down and left me a block away from this 143, and there was no flashing light. This is the Alcoholics Anonymous building. But I walked down that street, and I began to shake. And up the street came a nice-looking man, and he had a paper sack in his hand. And that I always related to either a quart or a fifth. And he turned into that door that I'd been there in the morning, and I thought, what's he doing in that building? So I hesitated a minute, and I thought, go on. And I turned the knob, and it opened, and I started walking up those stairs, and somebody called down and said, "Is that you, Margaret?" Because I told him my name was Margaret instead of Peg, and I'm generally Peg or Peggy. And so I walked up, and this man told me about AA in San Francisco, about the physical side of it. It was in this big loft, and I looked around this huge room, and it was very simple, but it was nice. And he said, "You know, none of us have a lot of money now, and we couldn't pay much for rent, and we had to do all the renovating ourselves." And they refinished the floors, they built cabinets, and they built a nice coffee bar at the end, and they served hot dogs and hamburgers and lots of coffee and lots of donuts. He also pointed out the different areas in that big room. One part of it was a small office for a very underpaid secretary by the name of Ann Newark. She was Ann Chambers then, and then she became Ann Newark, and she was really my sponsor. Though we didn't talk about sponsors like in San Francisco at that time the way we probably should have and the way we all talk about sponsors today. However, Ann couldn't have been more wonderful to me, and she gave me a feeling for the program, and if I had questions, she would always answer them. She was a gentle person. She wasn't a but I was sort of glad of that. However, I want to tell you more about what it was like within the fellowship. It was feisty. The steering committee had lots of quarrels, and I remember one night when I was sitting there after I'd been there about 2 months, they came out of the steering committee before a big meeting, and I heard a man, he was a lawyer, and his name was Horace, and he said, "Oh, my God." He said, "They're all just rugged individualists. You can't do a thing with them." And then a very nice man said, "Oh, easy does it." And that nice man had taken me to dinner a few nights before, and we had eaten at a place called the Iron Horse, and we had their deluxe dinner for 75 cents. And that was nice. I later married that dissenter, and he was a dissenter, but he was a wonderful man, and I just want to mention him today because he is not here, and he had Alzheimer's, and he went to great lengths to get his sobriety. Twice he put himself in a state institution, and in the 30s and in the early 40s, state institutions for helping the alcoholics were not very good. They were not very cozy, and they really didn't know how to handle us. So I had great respect for my husband, and he loved AA. He was a quiet man, and he did his own helping very, very quietly. and his service. Now I will remember something else to say. Anyway, that was the way it was when I first came in to AA. There were lots of things that we didn't do that are done now. Of course, there are recovery places to go to, as we have heard so wonderfully today from Dr. Bob's son, Bob, how they took care of people in their own homes. They were still doing that a bit in San Francisco. I remember I stayed all night with a girl who upset a whole bottle of formaldehyde on my brand new leather bag. And I loved that bag, and I hadn't been able to afford a nice bag like that for a long time. And this formaldehyde, I don't think many of you remember, or you would have laughed harder, because formaldehyde smelled terrible, and it got in the leather, and I never could use that bag again. I didn't help too many people at home, and that was beginning to, people were not doing that so much because there were hospitals that would take alcoholics, though you still had to say you had heart trouble or stomach trouble or very bad sinus to get in. But the doctors would wink, and they would take care of you. At least they would get you detoxed, so to speak. There were other things that were different. I can remember when hand-holding first started. Hand-holding, I remember this was Ann Newark's second husband. He raced into our living room one night and he said, "You won't believe what they're doing in the downtown meeting in San Francisco when they do the Lord's Prayer. They hold hands." He said, "I'm not going to hold anybody's hand." And he didn't for quite a while, but he finally came to and did it, because it's a very wonderful thing. I think someone mentioned that last night at the big meeting in the Dome. There were other things that people didn't do, and of course, 90 days and 90 meetings, that's quite new. And when somebody said that to me, I didn't really know what they were talking about. And that was when I lived up in Santa Rosa for a while, up in Sonoma County. And that was, yes. There were people at the time that I came into AA, I would like to pay a tribute to them. People didn't drive Mercedes then. I'll bet there weren't 50 Mercedes in San Francisco in the 40s or 50s, even if they had that many. There were no Japanese cars, and people didn't have cars. Some of the men who had gone to war, and they hadn't been back very long, the ones that were lucky to come back, if you did want a car, you had to put in an order, and you waited months and months from Detroit, the cars were coming from. We did not have the facilities to do what we are able to do now, but I think that was good for us. I really do. And we were all products of the Depression, which made us probably more frugal than you are today. When I first came in, there was a concept, too, that had a great deal of arguing about. And from the East and Middle West and even down South, the concept of the neighborhood meeting was coming into being. Well, when that was introduced in San Francisco at first, people said, "We won't go in our neighborhoods to meetings. We don't want everybody to see us going in that church or that building." But they hashed that out, and the first neighborhood meeting in San Francisco was in 1946, and that was in the Mission District, and then they started to blossom. And my home meeting became a meeting on Van Ness Avenue. It was in the basement of the Episcopal Church, and I have a very, very warm feeling for that home meeting. That was at St. Luke's Church. When that meeting first opened, I didn't feel, I hadn't been in the fellowship very long, and I didn't think I was qualified to go to a first meeting of some new neighborhood meeting, so I didn't go. But I heard two men afterwards say, "Well, we can't go to that meeting very long because they put a buck in the basket." A buck in the basket, and so we're still putting a buck in the basket. Let's put in just a little more than buck. Because we spend a lot more for everything else. And Alcoholics Anonymous, as we heard today, we must protect it in every way. Those were the things that I remember so clearly and dearly, and I feel so appreciative of the people that I met at that time. There weren't very many of us, and the meetings at that building at 143 Bush, they held meetings every day. The newcomers meeting was on Tuesday night. The big meeting was Wednesday night, and they put up 50 to 60 chairs, and that was a big meeting in San Francisco at that time. They worked hard, and people were interested in getting the word out. We had some marvelous secretaries at first, and they were able to meet business people and get the word around that we weren't just crazy people, that we were interested in doing something about our problem drinking, that we were really on the way to sobriety, and that they should, if they possibly could, let their employees know that there was a way to handle a problem drinker if you were hiring those kind of people, and a lot of people were. I went on in AA, and I married that nice man Bob, and at that time we were the first people in AA to have a baby at that particular group, and that was in 1948, and my daughter Martha was born, and she also belongs to Alcoholics Anonymous. Yes, that's nice. I have seen many changes in AA, and I am so grateful for what has been said here at this particular meeting, because Alcoholics Anonymous, that book, Becomes of Age, that is a wonderful, wonderful book. The first time I ever read that book, I wept with pride. I really did. I was so glad that I knew about Alcoholics Anonymous, and I could wear a badge like this, saying I was an alcoholic. The people that have gone before all of us, I hope I'm always indebted to those people. The people that did the traditions, I think, were just marvelous, just wonderful. And I can remember at a meeting at that St. Luke's church, my husband was able, no, he wasn't my husband then, but he read those traditions, and all of us really wept at that meeting, and I think there were about 20 or 25 people at that meeting. And so history was in the making in San Francisco at that time, and I always have gone to meetings. I don't think I have done enough service in this wonderful organization, but I have tried to help singly the person who needed help. And I have reached out my hand, and sometimes not too well, but I have done the best of my ability. And I have made wonderful friends in AA, and the spiritual side of the program, to me, is my platform. I do belong to a certain church, but where I really feel comfortable, and I am comfortable talking to all of you scary people, really. I'm not nervous. I may sound nervous, but I really, inside of me, I feel quite calm, and I feel very happy. And I know that there is that marvelous power, greater than anybody. That power is in the room today. Now, I'm going to close just by telling you something that happened to my husband and myself in 1980 and 81. We went back to New York and up to Montreal, and we went to see Lois F., who is the most marvelous coordinator of a convention. Oh, Lois has done a wonderful job on this convention, hasn't she? Yeah. We went to see Lois at the office in New York, and that was an experience I will never forget as long as I live. When we got off the elevator and saw the picture of Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson, a great big lump came in my throat, and I could hardly speak to Lois. I was so moved. And my husband was too, but he was getting sick, but he realized where he was, and he was very, very pleased. And Lois introduced us to everyone, and Nell Wing, whom all of you saw last night, in the archives, she showed Bob his own signature that he had attended the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous in San Francisco. And that was very thrilling for him because he could get that message. He understood. And it was for me and Lois and Nell, too, because we could see the expression on his face, and I was very, very pleased that we had done just that. And so I will close now by saying, faith with trust is what I try to practice. And I always try to remember what Dr. Bob said. Keep it simple. And Bill said, pass it on. Thank you.